test review pertains to World War II. So, following the New Deal, we exit the Great Depression. Finally, during World War II, as the US becomes the arsenal of democracy, joins the war, it ultimately becomes one of the victors on the Allied side. So, one of the key ideas to bear in mind is that between World War I and World War II, the United States wants to remain out of wars. They are isolationist. Now, that being said, the US does creep slowly but surely closer and closer to becoming interventionist, meaning getting involved in things. So, the US in the beginning, their main goal is to avoid foreign wars. However, over time, the US begins to wield influence over other nations with foreign investment, diplomacy, and some selective military intervention. So we ended World War I by looking at the fact that the United States fails to achieve its objectives at the Paris Peace Conference. President Wilson wanted a League of Nations, cooperation, and in his 14 points, he listed out a set of ideals that he would hope could achieve world peace going forward. But unfortunately, Woodrow Wilson contracts the Spanish flu during the pandemic of 1918. And ultimately, when he's on the road trying to promote his vision, has a stroke. This meant that America would not be able to assert its opinions, and he lost his ability to advocate for them to the American people. So America did not ratify the Treaty of Versailles, nor did it join the League of Nations. But the US did conduct some international policies in order to try to make it so we could achieve a degree of peace and avoid foreign wars while remaining isolationist. One of the ways in which we did this was through the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which was signed by many nations, such as the US, France, Germany, Great Britain, and others, which tried to prevent wars going forward by saying, we will not fight any longer. We are no longer going to use war as a way for resolving conflict. Now, the problem is, once Hitler starts his rise in the late 1930s and into the 1940s, at this point, there's no enforcement mechanism. There's no way to hold these people accountable if they were to go to war. While this is all happening, Germany is beginning to spiral economically because they are blamed for World War I and are forced to pay billions in reparations. The Germans experience what's called hyperinflation, an economic shock which causes a massive crash of their economy. And because they crash economically, they can't make up their reparations payments, which were owed to France, Britain, Belgium, and other countries. So Belgium and France actually invade Germany and occupy the Ruhr, their industrial center, until repayments would begin. The United States, of course, wants to resolve these problems by trying to prevent another war. And so the U.S. creates what's called the Dawes Plan, which would allow the United States to provide funds to Germany to continue their payments and prevent another war from breaking out. So France and Belgium withdraw from the region. And this is an example of the ways in which the U.S. used their economy to prevent wars from happening going forward. That being said, the U.S. did occasionally use its military to intervene. And in this case, President Sam, who was the Haitian president, was assassinated. Now, President Sam was open to U.S. business and had an alliance with the U.S., and so this affected U.S. business interests. If we remember, under the Roosevelt corollary, if Latin American countries went against U.S. interests, Roosevelt asserted that the U.S. should have the right to intervene. So under the Wilson administration, the U.S. sent the Marines to Haiti, occupy Haiti, rewrite its constitution, and tried to make sure that business could continue to thrive in Haiti, making it so that the United States was getting what it wanted out of the country resource-wise. Now, FDR would go on to reverse this with what he calls the good neighbor policy in the 1930s. Instead of relying on military intervention with Latin American countries like Teddy Roosevelt's Roosevelt corollary or the big stick policy, he sticks to a good neighbor policy, which would lead to the withdrawal of troops from Haiti. And instead of focusing on military, we would begin to form trade relationships with other countries. Now, the United States deals with a threat in the 1930s of the rise of fascism. In Italy, we have Benito Mussolini. We have Adolf Hitler in Germany, and Emperor Hirohito in Japan, who are each taking territory around the world. Hitler is taking territory in Central Europe, including the Sudetenland, in areas near Czechoslovakia, the Rhineland, which was taken away from them after World War I. And Mussolini was taking territory in Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa. And Japan was taking a brutal assault on China out and really doing some horrible humanitarian crises there. Now, the US really wasn't equipped to do much about this because the Kellogg Brand Pact had no enforcement mechanism and we refused to join the League of Nations. So these fascist countries take out aggression that doesn't remain stopped. That is until Hitler invades Poland, signaling a breaking of the non aggression pact with the Soviet Union and beginning World War II. In 1935, as the United States witnessed what was happening with Germany, the US signed the Neutrality Act, which said we're not getting involved with any foreign wars. But as Hitler began doing more and more damage across Western Europe, the US decides that they should intervene, right? The US had a policy of appeasement and then they shift to a more interventionist model. They begin by providing weapons to the British through cash and carry, where the British could drive to the United States in their boats, pick up the weapons, and sail back to Britain. The second was destroyers for bases, where in exchange for large naval vessels, the U.S. would get military bases throughout the British territorial holdings. And then last was Lend-Lease, where the U.S. basically just started giving lots and lots of weapons to Great Britain to stop them from being attacked by the Germans and to help them defend during the Battle of Britain. During 1941, the U.S., while giving resources to the democracies of the world, cut off the Axis, including Japan, from oil and steel. And in response to this, in 1941, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, signaling the U.S. entrance into World War II. So we're going to pick it up here. Now, when the U.S. declared war, they began mobilizing, and they call on all groups making this a total war to join the war effort. Black Americans were encouraged to join by other Black Americans through what was called the Double V campaign. This meant that if Black folks helped to join the war and fight for a victory abroad, this could mean an end to segregation at home, aka a victory at home. So victory at home and victory abroad. Now, that being said, the U.S. military was still segregated until 3 years after World War II. And veterans and other Black folks had planned a march on Washington, protesting that if they could serve abroad, they should be able to get decent work at home. So veterans returned and equality was still not guaranteed. So while the Double V campaign did help mobilize Black folks, it didn't necessarily achieve the goal of killing Jim Crow. That being said, there were some baby steps that were taken to provide for the civil rights of Black Americans. One of them being the Executive Order 8802, which banned racial discrimination in the defense industry, making it so that white and Black folks could get access to unions and companies engaged in war-related work. And also, of course, in 1948, we have the dismantling of segregation of our military. Women were recruited to work in the industrial war making, material making industries, and Rosie the Riveter was used to encourage women to get involved with the war effort. The War Production Board was the organization dedicated from converting civilian factories into war-making factories. And this was really important because without those factories, we don't have the weapons and other things. And women played an instrumental role in this. Because of this, women got access and improved opportunities in other domains, like professional sports. During World War II, we saw the emergence of the Rockford Peaches, who were a professional baseball organization playing in a league made up of all women. And this signaled that because women were participating during World War II in the industrial sector, it also meant that they would be able to participate in things outside of it, like professional sports. And again, this happens during World War II as a way to sort of represent the contributions and equality of women. Mexicans and Mexican Americans were also called on to serve, not just in the military, but then also through the Bracero program. Many Mexicans were brought to the United States from Mexico to work in this program. The Bracero program was really important during World War II because it provided immediate work in the agricultural industry, which helped to feed a lot of the troops on the front lines. And while these were short term contracts, more than 4 million Mexicans came to the United States to serve in these roles between 1942 and 1960, which was really important to the agricultural interests of America. That doesn't mean that they were without its controversies. The program was known to undercut wages for domestic farm work. Many felt as though the Mexicans were being exploited, and also some Mexicans were targeted for their cultural differences. For example, in LA, the Zoot Suit riots occurred where people attacked Mexicans and Mexican Americans for wearing zoot suits because of their, again, cultural differences. We also saw that materials had to be conserved to make sure that people on the home front were saving some for the troops, including Liberty Gardens, growing food at home rather than buying at the grocery store, and car sharing. Now, when the war broke out, there are two fundamental sides you got to know. We have the Axis powers and the Allies. The Allies were made up of France, America, Britain, and the Soviet Union. The Axis made up of Japan, Italy, and Germany. Now, the United States was bombed at Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. And when this happens, the U.S. declares war several days later. But it wasn't just at Pearl Harbor where the United States was attacked. They were also attacked in the Philippines, which was a U.S. territory acquired during the Spanish-American War. And while the goal of Pearl Harbor was to cripple the United States naval fleet, it doesn't actually do this because while it did significant damage, many aircraft carriers were out of the port during this time period, which would have been extremely detrimental to the United States. And so the U.S. ends up being able to recover because of its mobilization and get going to prepare for the Pacific. Now, in the Pacific, two big battles to be familiar with are the Battle of Coral Island and the Battle of Midway. Both of these serve as turning points because it allowed the U.S. to take territory both at sea and on land and begin pushing the Japanese back closer and closer and closer to Japan. After these two battles, they conducted the war by doing something called island hopping, where the United States went from island to island, focusing on ones that were non-fortified to make sure that the U.S. could continually advance closer and closer to Japan. Now, while all this is happening, the Manhattan Project is occurring in the United States. We have the Trinity site in New Mexico at Los Alamos, under the football field at the University of Chicago. The Manhattan Project was a top secret World War II project to build a new type of atomic bomb that could do significant damage to the enemy and end the war quickly. The U.S. faced a real question. Should they invade Japan and sustain significant casualties or end the work as quickly as possible? The U.S. took the former and ultimately decided to launch two bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These bombs have an estimated death total of about 210,000 people, including many civilians. Now, this again, in theory, was done to prevent the cost of more lives than the 200,000 seen here. And in all likelihood, a full-scale invasion of Japan would have been much more costly. That being said, it is certainly a dark moment in U.S. history. And although it did force a Japanese surrender and help to bring an end to the war, many civilians die in this moment. And it's really questionable as to whether or not it was justified. And I think depending on the person you ask, you'll get many different answers. On the Eastern Front, or excuse me, I shouldn't say the Eastern Front, I should say on the European front, the United States, the Soviet Union, and the British were planning how they could take France back and defeat the Nazis. These three, the big three, so to speak, met at Tehran and started to debate how they could go about ending this war. They then began planning the D-Day invasion. The Soviets pledged to join in the Pacific after the Nazis were dead. And also we saw the beginning plans being laid out for the creation of the United Nations. So this signaled that the war, when the United States entered, was coming slowly but surely to an end, and they wanted a plan for after the fact. Now, the D-Day invasion occurs in the in the north of France, where the Allied forces, including Canada, the United States, and Great Britain, launch an offensive on the northern part of France to drive the Nazis back to Germany. And to be super oversimplify, it is overwhelmingly successful despite the mass casualties that are faced. The Germans retreat and would continue to retreat through the Battle of the Bulge all the way back to Berlin, making it so that the United States ultimately would become victors. But that being said, while they're forcing the Germans back to Berlin, the United States unravels what would become known as the Holocaust. They find concentration camps full of Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, and many other people who had been targeted for killings in death camps. Now, the soldiers that are arriving here have no idea what's going on. They don't know what to see. And it's really shocking to the international community in the aftermath of World War II. And it's one of the reasons why the war takes on a whole different meaning. Because the Holocaust signaled that the Nazis were really the bad guys in this affair, and the U.S. helping to liberate meant that they would become sort of seen as the good guys of World War II. This led to VE Day. Ultimately, the Nazis are defeated. Hitler is commits suicide, and the war ends. And the United States emerges as a victor. Now, that being said, on the home front, during this all, the U.S. Developed what were called more or less concentration camps out of the fear of Japanese spies. And FDR issues Executive Order 9066, forcing that all people of Japanese descent, whether they were citizens or not, to go to camps off of the coast of the United States. This was a huge violation of people's civil rights according to the Constitution. And at these camps, people were expected to do significant work. If you take a look here, many of them were working on farms. They would be guarded by U.S. military. They would grow food, keep livestock, and make materials for the war, like camouflage nets, which were often seen at relocation centers. One of the people that was living there at the time, Fred Korematsu, was arrested for refusing to relocate to a prison camp, and his case got all the way to the Supreme Court. Now, he argued that he felt as though he had the right, if he was going to be brought to a camp and basically be arrested, he felt that he should be brought to a trial, because he was like, what crime have I committed? I'm simply a Japanese American. Now, the Supreme Court determined that the U.S. was justified because Executive Order 9066, they argued, was valid because it protected national security during wartime. And Fred Korematsu, years later, was apologized to and get awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1998 for his bravery of speaking up. And ultimately, it took another Supreme Court case to reverse a lot of the policies, including the incarceration of Japanese Americans. After Japanese internment was over, in 1946, we started to see that there was an official repeal of this executive order and an apology. And in 1988, those folks were awarded $20,000 in reparations for the 80,000 Japanese Americans who were treated so poorly. Now, many of the folks that were sent away were forced to sell their houses, possessions, and businesses. And so $20,000 barely scratched the surface for a lot of these people. It's really significant that these residents probably lost upwards of $400 million in property during this time period. So it is a real bummer and really a moment in history that would be considered a dark spot, especially in the history of World War II. Now, the very last thing we're going to talk about is how after World War II ends, compromises between the Soviet Union, the United States, and Great Britain are laid out at Yalta and Potsdam. In February, the big three meet again and start to decide what would happen to the to Germany and Japan after the fact, and they begin outlining plans for dividing up Germany, Japan, Korea, and other occupied territories. Now, a couple months later at Potsdam, when they met, FDR had died and Winston Churchill had lost his election. And this meant that we have three very different folks meeting at Potsdam. President Truman now also knew that he would have an atomic bomb at his disposal, which he would be able to leverage without the help of the Soviet Union. And so these guys end up clashing a lot more, and there's major tension between President Truman and Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. And ultimately, this tension is going to kick off in our next unit because they aren't able to foster agreements together, and they have a very different vision for the future, which we'll see play out in unit number 8.